and welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Have you ever tried to pull back the curtain on your internal machinery? Everyone has wondered about the nature of reality at some point, but fewer people have wondered about the nature of themselves and how they relate to what we assume is physically out there. And that is an assumption. As it turns out, there are numerous possibilities with consequences that can make us question everything, even our own existence. All right, so last week we talked about dreams, and that led us to some really weird places where we were talking about, things like, our whole idea of the universe being a dream of an advanced alien civilization and stuff.
Yeah.
And I know there were some listeners out there that were like, okay, well, that's a cool kind of thought experiment or daydream or whatever, but, that's not something that could really be possible. And then I sent you an article early this week talking about how scientists are thinking, well, maybe the universe is just this whole thing that's kind of self-simulating itself, or maybe there are aliens that are, simulating us and stuff. So, these people are philosophers in some regard, but they're also, the top minds in physics and other scientific fields. So they're not people that are just sort of prognosticating on a philosophy podcast somewhere. These are people with actual knowledge about how the universe works, saying, we really could be a simulation of an advanced species, or maybe there is an advanced species. Maybe the universe is just kind of simulating itself into existence.
Yeah.
And so that's something that's kind of hard to chew on. And it doesn't really make sense if you don't examine your own relationship to the outside world. So that's what we're going to do today, is talk about the mind-body problem. And basically, how this physical stuff that we're made out of, how that relates to our own internal experience of what being alive means. So this is going to take us to some really weird places. And I think I have a grand total of like 2 questions on my sheet, because I know that just looking at those things is going to take up the whole episode. So
yeah, it will.
So why don't you explain to us really quick what the mind-body problem is?
Okay, so everyone, I think, has heard of Descartes, René Descartes, who really substantively developed the idea of dualism. The mind being one thing, the body being the other, and wrapped up in all of that is the question of mental phenomena, non-physical things such as the mind being distinct from the body, and how can it be that the mind can make the body do something? It's more complicated than that, but that's really the essence of it. And so caught up in that is the things like subject, object. I'm a subject. I see an object. I decide to pick it up. Well, how did my mind make my body do that?
Yeah, and that's really weird. Everybody can do this experiment where you just look at your hand and you open it and close it and you go, well, how does that really work?
Yeah.
You can look at a car, and figure out, okay, well, this gear is driving this shaft and that shaft is turning this wheel, and have some understanding of it. And on a scientific level, you can look at it and say, okay, well, there's an electrical current running from my brain down my spine through this nerve, and that's, twitching these muscles that are connected to these tendons that are connected to bones, and it's moving. But that doesn't describe the experience of opening and closing your hand. That gives, it's something different, Yeah. So I think the best way to look at this is going just section by section, breaking down the different philosophical approaches. And then at the end, we'll try to tie together what it means for reality. So You already mentioned the one major camp, the one major school of thought, which is dualism, which is, primarily, espoused by Descartes. There's also monism, right?
Yeah.
Which says that the mind isn't a separate thing from the body. The mind derives from the body, which seems kind of like an intuitive thing. You'd think, okay, well, my brain's in my body. It's made out of physical stuff. So yeah, and, my mind is physical, right?
Right.
But it's not really that clear cut. So we have monism and dualism, and we've made the basic distinctions between those, but there's all these different flavors in between. So we'll look at dualism first. So
Okay.
you mind going over substance dualism?
Well, so what we're talking about here is the idea that, going to Descartes again, Descartes essentially said that intelligence is part of the brain. In other words, part of the physical apparatus, but that consciousness is non-physical. So substance dualism talks about that which can be touched, seen, observed, the empirical stuff, and the idea is that mental activity can exist outside the body, and the body itself doesn't think.
Okay. So, would it be oversimplifying it to say that Descartes' position is kind of that the mind is the soul, kind of?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. So it's kind of this immortal soul sort of thing where, okay, you have the body and the mind, and that does the controlling of the physical aspect, but there's this other part that is separate from the body and the mind.
Right. So when you die, your soul moves on.
And that's your consciousness, all of those other things.
Apparently. So that's substance dualism. Then there's property dualism. And property dualism says that the mind is different than the physical human, but totally anchored in the physical human, so that when the human dies, the soul is done.
Okay. So, yeah.
So
I'm trying to think. So, property dualism says your mind, your soul is separate from your body, but when your body dies, that dies with you.
Well, it's not. Yeah, it's not entirely. It's not entirely separate. Property dualism suggests that there are two things, but that they are linked.
Okay.
So there are mental properties, there are physical properties, but those things are inextricably bound up, even though they're discernibly different from each other. That's property dualism.
Okay.
Now we may be going too deep with this for what we're trying to talk about. I don't know.
All right. So those are kind of the two big schools of dualism. In monism, we have quite a few more flavors. And one thing that we'll see is that some of them kind of bleed back into dualism. I'm especially thinking of neutral monism here. Neutral monism and property dualism, I am not entirely sure what the distinct difference between them is.
I think for the purposes of what we're talking about, they're very close, but the difference is there's a coexistence that is inseparable from monism, and the soul moves on anyway. So in monism, which is arguably part of religious systems, that the mind and body cannot be extricated from one another. Property dualism suggests that there is a difference between mind and body, but they are still linked, and it's a more mechanistic notion, so that when the machine stops, the lights go out, basically, and so there is nothing past that. Monism says when the machine stops, the soul still moves on, because the soul and the body are part of one another. And I suppose, although I'm treading into difficult ground here in saying this, I suppose those who believe in such things as the rapturing of the body, in evangelical terms, would probably find themselves in a monist kind of camp.
Yeah, because that it gets sort of complicated, right? Because it depends on what, if it's a religious thing, it depends sort of on your theology, whether or not you're a monist or dualist. Because Descartes was a Christian philosopher, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So his idea of dualism was, okay, my body might die, but my soul goes on. So he was dualist, but he was a Christian philosopher, whereas a monist Christian philosopher would believe my body dies, but my body will be resurrected with my soul because they're one thing.
Yes.
So being a monist or a dualist doesn't necessarily dictate your theological views. It just dictates sort of the semantics of whether your physical body is going to be resurrected into the afterlife or not.
Or whatever that might mean. Yeah, right. So now there is a very a strong form of monism that says there is nothing but the body, and the idea of consciousness is all the mechanics of the body. And so there. Who are some of the most famous? Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, these kind of folks would posit that this is when you look at the mind, you can see the mind. You can see the brain working on the MRI machines, right, or the various technologies, and so you can see when emotions happen, those kind of things. The next step beyond that is that there's no soul, there's no abstracted anything independent of the physicality. The machine is the machine. The machine is what creates the ghost in the machine to essentially keep the machine company or running. And so it's that kind of monism would say it's all just the substance.
Right. So the idea of monism or dualism goes beyond religious or theological thought. You could be a monist or a dualist and be a religious person, but you could also, even if you're an agnostic or atheistic person, most of them are going to tend towards monism. Can you be a dualist and be an atheist, do you think?
Yes. Yeah, I do, because if your dualism, because remember, Descartes, as well as beyond him, Leibniz, who was working with the Christian view on this, and many, many others. But you can say that there's consciousness that's somehow independent of the body. When the body dies, perhaps the consciousness enters something else, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you believe there's a particular systemic religious structure that it goes to. The ghost moves on.
Right. And I've been reading just a ton of interesting studies on this exact same idea recently, and the one that's sticking out in my mind is they're trying to formulate a new theory. It's kind of a grand unifying theory. And what they're thinking is, a big problem with classical physics has been, this wave versus particle type duality. Yeah. And so now they're starting to speculate that maybe the fundamental elements of reality are actually shards of energy, pieces of energy, you know. And in one of the articles I was reading, they alluded to the fact that, well, maybe, if everything's made up of pieces of energy, maybe when you die, your consciousness, the pieces of energy that make up your consciousness kind of flow back into the universe. So I guess that would sort of be an atheistic or agnostic dualism, if you think of it that way. You're not your physical body's dying, but then your consciousness or your mind is sort of reuniting with the universe in some way.
Right. Which and yes, and that could be atheistic in the sense that you say that the universe is somehow sentient, but that doesn't mean it's God. And it also doesn't mean that if you're merging with the universe that you are somehow going to end up with a re-emergence into another body, another time, or that you're going to go through some kind of punitive stations through which your soul is cleansed so you can be worthy of something. It doesn't imply any of those things.
Yeah, and that's kind of that's sort of the interesting trend I'm seeing in this sort of physics and metaphysics research, is that a few years ago it was all about sort of being in an alien simulation, or some sort of external conscious influence creating the universe, that sort of thing. The shift I'm kind of seeing right now is more towards a self-simulation, or just, a dissolving into an energy field, or even sort of a big bounce thing where, no, there really never was any kind of beginning that was set in motion by some sort of creator.
It's always been there.
It's this looping thing. Yeah. In your mind, is that kind of a turtles all the way down argument, or do you think that there's something to that?
Well, my mind is not large enough, despite the fact that I study and read, to say anything of certitude. But it doesn't, while boggling, and while in one of the articles we read, was talking about William James and using the term ineffable, which is a lovely, beautiful word. And that ineffable means things can't be put into words. And so that sort of connects with other podcasts we've done. So to say something has always existed means that there wasn't a beginning. And that's itself boggling, but I don't find it so boggling as to be unacceptable.
Yeah, no, based off of the conversations we've had in the past, nothing about that seems strange, because time is one of the weirdest things that we've talked about. And we're still kind of undetermined whether or not it's purely a human construct, just something that we have to make sense of reality, but not something that's actually part of what's happening. So if it's the former, if we're just experiencing time in order for, our brains, our electrical systems to make sense of what's going on, then the fact that there's no beginning or no end really wouldn't be that big of a jump.
Well, no, it wouldn't. And built into some religious systems, the idea of omniscience, that everything is known. Well, if everything's known, it's all present all at the same time, and which is what some who are agnostic or atheistic would say. Okay, so as you say, we're experiencing time in a variety of ways. We can live in the past, present, and the future all at the same moment already, if you think about what our brains do.
Yeah, and Einstein said that too. I think Einstein said that the universe is like a vinyl record, and a human is just like the needle.
Yeah.
Right? So there you are, and you're going around the record, and that's you experiencing time. But when you get to the end of the record, the end of your life, it's not like the record ceases to exist. You just it's not playing anymore. It's done.
It's on the shelf.
Yeah. So this leads back to what we were talking about last week with the dreams, where we were saying, we're trying to determine if dreams are a form of consciousness or not. And what we were saying is, okay, well, certain parts of your brain are just as active as if you were awake, but then there's certain parts of your brain that aren't. So you have certain mental faculties, but you're lacking other mental faculties. And then we said, okay, well, in a fully conscious state like you and I are right now, we're saying that we have all of our mental faculties. But do all of our mental faculties encompass the totality of mental faculties? No, we know that we don't see the full electromagnetic spectrum. Right. We know we don't hear the full frequency spectrum. So there's other things happening that we're not perceiving. And indeed, there's some things that, based off of our electrical wiring, we could not comprehend. So is, why do we insist on saying that what we're experiencing right now is fact, reality, or truth? It makes it sort of debatable. And this is another study I was reading yesterday where they were talking about, it was actually a study on consciousness. And what they did is they had people stare at an X on the wall, and then they took a playing card and put it out to the side of their vision, and then they flip it over, and they ask them, what suit is it? What color is it? What, all this different stuff. What they found is, like, unless it's dead center on that spot, people can't even identify what color the card is, much less what suit it is or how many clubs are on it or whatever the case may be. And, there's various theories for what's happening there. Some of them are an integration theory where it's saying, okay, well, the mind is perceiving all of the things in the visual field, but it can only give characteristics to the things that are in its focus. So it's seeing the red on the card. It's seeing the diamond shapes. Yeah. It's seeing the A for, it's seeing the 4 for the, the 4 or whatever. But because it's not focusing on it, it can't give the redness the quality to the thing. It can't give the diamond the quality to the thing. It's seeing the diamond, the red, and the 4, but it can't give it meaning because it's not focused on it.
This is materialist, by the way. This is the materialist view that you're describing.
And the study that I was reading, they rejected that because what they said is, okay, well, even though it's in the visual field, people can't identify even the color, even the most basic thing they can't pick up on. So it's not like it's a failure to integrate. The mind's seeing the red, but it can't give it, it can't say that it's a red 4 of diamonds. They're saying, no, you can't even see the red because I forgot the other part of it. There's 3 numbers outside of it as well. So there's like 3 numbers around the wall, a 4, 4, 4. And so they told people to focus on the X, showed them the playing card, asked them what it was and whatnot. Then they went back afterwards, asked them various questions about it. What color was the card? What number was on the card? What suit was the card? And then, oh, hey, by the way, how many numbers were on the wall outside the card? And then asked people to gauge their confidence. And what they found is the majority of people said there was 2 numbers outside the card and they were very confident in it when there was actually 3. And so they said, okay, well, it's not that they're perceiving all this stuff but not giving focus to it. The mind is actually excluding certain information, which denies the integration theory. And they're using this sort of research to try to pin down what consciousness is. So we think about it as philosophy and as these questions that are never going to be answered. And, I'm of the persuasion that they never will be in their totality. We're never going to completely pin it down. But every day we're still learning more and more about some of these things that seem completely out of reach, like what is consciousness,
We are. And that in itself, to me, when you asked the question earlier about essentially, can I wrap my mind around the idea of the stack of turtles going on infinitely, which is referencing, for those who may find that a strange statement, is referencing the idea that of some Aboriginal ancient cultures posit various animals on which the back of the world sits, and the foundations of the world, in other words. But what you're talking about is a kind of infinity of questioning, which would imply an always presence of a universal consciousness, that makes it possible to infinitely question. There's no end to the questions. Therefore, perhaps there was no beginning to the questions either.
Yeah, man, reality's super weird. Let's get back on track. Let's look at some of the other schools of monism so that we can kind of bring it together and actually discuss we have been discussing what the implications are for reality, but so we have a better picture of all the solutions.
Okay, so
we talked about
substance
dualism, property dualism.
Yeah.
Monism. How about physicalism? That's kind of our basic idea that the mind's the physical part of us, right?
Yeah, right. And that's what I was mentioning a moment ago. Physicalism. There's the only reality is the physical world. It's a kind of it's a materialism in the sense that apart. There's nothing apart from the material world. The material world accounts for everything, including consciousness, which is a machine generating the viewpoint. So when you want reality, it's here. I can tap the table. I know it's real. I can feel the arthritis in my hands. I know that's real. I can pet my cat over here behind me because we all have cats when we talk in these days. And and the cat said meow. I heard that. Therefore, it's real. So that's the materialist view. Then there's the phenomenalism, phenomenology, which we've referenced before, which is this relationship between the subject, which would be us, the subject being that which is doing the perceiving, and an object, such as the cat, that we're interacting with and making some kind of sense of. And the phenomenalists essentially say that only mental objects exist, that we are essentially, our body is nothing but the perception of the mind. One of the Bishop Berkeley was one of the people who was talking about this. Interestingly, so there's been some research into this and some discussion of this. So phenomenalists will approach stroke victims who have lost parts movement on the side of the body and look because of the damage to the one hemisphere or another. And so some people who have that kind of damage and can look in a mirror, moving their right and left hands equally well, in their sense of things in the mirror, even though it doesn't necessarily happen.
Yeah, and this is another one where there's some psychology stuff that is super fascinating. I remember watching a video one time of it was another, I think it was a stroke victim, and they were asking her to draw a cat, and she drew half a cat. And they were like, "What do you think of it? Does it look good?" "Yeah, it looks real good and stuff." And then the researcher was like, "Do you see that there's only half a cat here?" She goes, "Oh yeah, I must have forgot to draw the other half." So she drew it and thought that the cat was complete, but then when you drew attention to the fact that she only drew half of it, then she said, "Oh wait, yeah, no, I guess I must have forgot it," and she rationalizes away the fact that she thought it was a whole cat before. Yeah. So that idea of the mind, and especially how the mind works when you have some sort of damage to it, that psychologically it's fascinating. Philosophically, that's not quite what we're talking about, right? We're talking more about this is kind of the simulation theory, right? So we're saying that the mind is all there is, and our mind is just simulating reality. I'm not actually talking into a microphone or on a computer or anything. It's all just something my mind's kind of making up.
Right. In that sense, the phrase "mind over matter" becomes almost irrelevant because then it's just mind. The really vexing thing, one of the many vexing things about it is going back to what we said at the start, I think, and that makes things happen. So if I'm in a dream, going back to last week, my thinking, even in an unconscious way, is making things happen in some kind of strange, albeit non-linear narrative of whatever length, whatever images are coming in there. But the mind is creating that. The strict behaviorists, and you've encountered this in your educational studies so much, and something I've growled about over the years, and you've been party to hearing that, but that all we can psychologically ought to be concerned with is observable actions, stimulus response, cause effect. That you can't study thought scientifically terribly well, and so objectively that's just not a place that we should be going. Now, not all psychologists suggest that, but some do, and not all philosophers suggest that, but some do, and certainly the scientists, not just psychologists, but would say, well, right, we need to study what we can measure, what we can somehow see.
Yeah, and so these are kind of diametrically opposed, right? So you have behaviorism, where you're saying, all right, essentially behaviorists are kind of saying internal thought almost doesn't even exist. Like you're just sort of a machine, you're a meat machine, and a lot of it's pretty deterministic. Like you probably don't even really have free will. Like you're just kind of, stimulus is put in, and then you're responding to it based off of certain nature and nurture things that you've experienced throughout life. Mm-hmm. And then we have phenomenology or idealism, which is saying, no, actually, that physical stuff isn't really out there at all. Your mind's just creating it. And both of those sound just wrong to your normal everyday experience. But when you take the thought experiments to the extremes, they both have some measure of credibility, which is why very intelligent philosophers and psychologists have bought into the different camps over the years. Like you said, dreaming is really the big one for that other one. I had a crazy dream last night where there was me and a group of 4 other people were on a guided cliffside trail being led by 2 Amish guys. So these Amish guys are leading us along this cliffside trail. There's a beautiful valley down on the side, cliff on the right. And about every 100 feet, there's a building built into the cliff. And you walk in and it's like a little museum sort of thing. And I can't remember most of what was in these buildings, but I remember one in particular where I walked into the building and it's this elaborate Rube Goldberg wooden structure. And what it is it's actually the Be Our Guest scene from Beauty and the Beast, made out of wooden sculpture. So the one Amish guy turns a crank, and this wooden teapot on strings floats across the scene. It bumps into a teacup and tips water into the teacup. The teacup fills up, comes down, lands on a plate. The plate raises it up into a wooden bell's mouth. Belle drinks it. As the water drinks into her, she sinks down, which causes the candlestick. And I woke up and I was like, how did my mind make this happen? Like, this is something that would, remembering it in my dream, this is something that would take an engineer or a woodworker or something hundreds of hours to create. And my mind just off the cuff with no conscious input from me was like, oh, here it is, And so when you look at that phenomenology or, idealistically, you think, well, if my mind can do that with no input from the outside world, well, that lends some credence to it. Or if you look on sort of the reverse, right? Let's say that I'm in a coma and have no conscious input at all, and then I physically die. Well, did I really die if there was nothing happening there in the first place? So those kind of two things make you think, well, maybe there's something to phenomenology. And then you look on the other side with physicalism, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. You think, okay, well, I've got this 3 pounds of, neuronal jelly in my head, and there's an electrical current running through it, and that creates these things. If you take the magic out of it, and you say, okay, well, now it makes sense that an electrical current could run to an optic nerve, and that certain frequencies of light, could reflect these sorts of things. And my mind flips the image upside down and crosses it over, and then integrates it with the sound and all the other stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yeah, it makes sense that that's just the way it runs, and that there's nothing weird about it, nothing else going on. So these camps that seem super extreme when you just look at them on the surface, you think about them a little bit deeper, and you're like, no, I can kind of see people believe in either way that one of those is, a legitimate thing to think.
But yeah, and this is that's a fascinating dream, by the way. It all has all sorts of metaphorical possibilities, but I was enjoying the great detail of it, Joel. But you okay? So what this brings us to in part is what Carl Rogers. I don't know if you probably have read Rogers in your studies at some point or another. He was a humanist psychologist and philosopher. He had a great issue with mechanistic, materialistic monism. He said that subjective experiences are the only way we can study human behavior is through the subjective presentations of what human beings tell us. So there's a kind of phenomenalism there. So humanists like Rogers aren't saying that they aren't denying that there's a real world that exists. But what they think is most important is every individual's subjective and perhaps even unique way to approaching that world. And when we don't consider the sources of why that happens, or why it could be happening, or acknowledge that there are all of these viewpoints about the so-called real world, then we have a mess, basically, of fragments. I'm going back to the shards idea, shards and fragments. I mean, think of our culture right now. We have people who do not believe that COVID-19 exists. Again, I'm locking our talk in time and space, aren't I? We have scientists who know that it does and have proven it to us. We have people who say that it does, but that God will protect them, and if they are meant to get it, they will get it, and so they won't use masks. And Rogers would say, okay, well, that's a very individualistic, subjective approach to a reality. So it's like unto saying we have the capacity of creating our reality, and that may be far removed from the reality that actually exists.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect example, because like you said, anybody who's living through this time has definitely experienced that. There's and I think that's an important thing in making sense of this time, is looking at it, and I think everybody's saying to themselves, well, I can see what's really going on. Why can't everybody else see what's really going on? Mm-hmm. But that thought by itself should be enough to let you know that you don't really know what's going on. You have an assumption. You have an assumption. Everybody's drawing on different paradigms to try to determine what's happening. And some people are drawing on more reliable or established paradigms than others. But even somebody who, you were the number one test study, right? So I think that I'm drawing off of all the right paradigms. If I didn't think I was, I would draw off different ones. So I think I'm making all the right decisions, which is why to me, it seems crazy that other people don't think the way that I do. But I have to admit that even if I'm, you know, I could be 50% right. I could be 99% right. I don't know where I fall in there. I think that I have it all right, but I'm missing some piece of the puzzle. Even it might be small, it might be big. I'm missing something. And I think that's what we need right now is for everybody to just step back and realize, okay, everything seems self-evident to me. I think that I'm drawing off of the most accurate paradigms. I think that I have all the information. I think that I'm interpreting all the information right. And I think I'm applying all the information right. But I'm not. I'm missing something. That's what we need is for everybody to just realize, you know what? Everybody's missing something here. So maybe we should take a closer listen to what some other people are saying in order to kind of give ourselves a little bit of perspective.
But not be so bloody certain all the time, A, that we're right, and B, that our flawed perceptions in a dualistic sense, when we don't even are even incapable, we're not capable yet of determining what consciousness itself is. We ought not to be so blasted sure of so many, many other things. Bertrand Russell, have you ever read him, Joel?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I love it's just amazing. There's a marvelous graphic. It's not a novel; it's a graphic biography, essentially, of him that even the college library had, and I had to get it for myself because it's so good. But to read his philosophy, primary documents, it's amazing. But when you described your dream, and you talked about the teacup, and that clicked with me for Bertrand Russell. So I brought up a quotation I want to read to you because I think it pulls some of what we're talking about together. Russell says, if I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars, there is a china teapot revolving about the sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on to say that since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is an intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt my assertion, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. You see, doubt is terribly important, but in balance with the rest of the things that we know. I'm not quoting him anymore, but if he says, if, however, the existence of that teapot were affirmed in ancient books, taught as a sacred truth, and instilled into the minds of children, hesitation to believe in its existence would become a mark of eccentricity and entitle the doubter to the attention of the psychiatrist or the inquisitor.
Yeah. That's a perfect encapsulation of how humans develop knowledge, right? It's not just scientific facts and, all these things. Culture plays a huge part of it. And I think that what we're seeing in the day and age we currently live in is the influence of American culture on how people are determining their sources of knowledge, for better or worse, or for however you want to see it.
Yeah. It's easy enough to step away from that too, in the sense of just go and read or listen to the British broadcasting system, or Deutsche Welle, which is the German news system, and you find out just how not important one culture is when it's looked at through the eyes of another culture.
Right. Yeah, I love reading articles from overseas about American culture because I think that a lot of people think that they know they're going to describe us as a bunch of John Waynes who are idiots or whatever. And it's not really like that. Some of it is like that where you're like, okay, yeah, this fierce individualism, bullheadishness. But then some of it, they'll throw some things in there and you're like, ooh, I never really thought of that, but that's pretty accurate. Or, oh, wow, they kind of have that part of it. totally wrong. That's a misconception on their part because they're not part of the culture.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
But it's eye-opening either way, because the more habituated you are to a certain circumstance, the less you start to critically examine the context that you're in. You know.
Well said. Yeah, that's very well said. And that takes now we're back to dualism in a very real sense, because there's a thing called, and you've read about it because you read this. You're the one, you sent me this article from the Scientific American, this marvelous article about mind body and negative theology. And negative theology says that it's only the things that you're unable to say about God, or however one conceives of such things. It's one of those negative things that can show that the existence is actually there, because it causes you to question your own fundamental self. So are we mind? Are we matter? Are we a combination? What if we're not any of those things? Then we go back to the simulation.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is we're bringing it back around full circle because, you know, we just went over how hard it is to objectively look at something the more habituated you are to it. And nobody's habituated to anything more than their own consciousness. You've always had that throughout your whole life, and you've come to take it for granted. And what subjectively, your subjectivity and your objectivity are overlapping, right? So you think that the things you're experiencing are objectively real, when in reality, that's your subjective experience. And this brings us into some of the other weirder thought experiments in philosophy, where things like you might not exist. I might be the only thing that exists. Or maybe none of us exist and it's all a simulation or all this other stuff. And all of that stuff kind of challenges the context of consciousness, that the entire, the whole package, So yeah, and we've talked about some of this in our I think it was the second episode we ever did. We talked about God, and specifically various kind of concepts for that. And some of that kind of draws along the same lines. Like, when we're talking about implications of some of the things we've looked at, dualism and monism for reality, we get into the simulations and panpsychism and stuff. And some of that is very similar to pandeism and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of like we were saying, how you're sort of determining stuff, or negative theology, like you just mentioned, where, it's an inverse way of doing things rather than starting with a story of God that's been culturally passed down, and not critically examining it through a scientific lens. You're doing the opposite. You start with zero assumptions, and then you take the things that you know, and you take the things that you know and subtract the things that you can't explain, and then you have an area where something like that can exist. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's interesting about that is that it seems like that is always going to exist. No matter how good science gets, there's always going to be a spot where it can't answer questions. And that's where the philosophy and some of the negative theology or the mysticism, whatever way you're looking at it, that's where that kind of lives,
Yeah. The article you sent me, and you've said really well, and I don't know if you've even tread into this, but what David Chalmers, the philosopher, was saying, he draws from a recognizably Christian allusion, but he's an atheist, but he still draws it. He says, "How does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness?"
Yeah.
And he asks, why should there be consciousness at all? From an objective viewpoint, consciousness is utterly unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, and we all think about that. Everybody knows by this point. One of my favorite things to bring in is the animal thought experiments into our questions, right? Yeah. Because that's always going to be a fascinating topic, because we don't know what measure of consciousness they have. It's impossible to discern, because, like you said, we have the water of their brain, their mind. What's happening electrically, but we can't explain our own conscious perceptions, so we can't even begin to describe theirs. One thing that I was talking about with my wife the other day is, when I'm sleeping, our one cat will stay away from me. When I wake up, he'll always come and lay on my chest. Now, there's times where there's no discernible way to know I'm awake. I'll wake up, but I won't open my eyes. I won't move. I'll even keep my breathing the same, hoping that I'll be able to fall back asleep. There's no way to know I'm awake. But at the second that my consciousness opens up, I feel him stand up, walk over, and he comes and sits on my chest. And it makes you wonder, well, what is his experience that allows him to do that? Is he able to see into some wavelength and he can sense the heat of my body rising? Or can he hear some frequency as my brain waves shift? Or what is it? He might be sensing something completely different than I can even imagine that lets him know I'm awake, Yep. And so the conscious experience of animals, is kind of a weird thing. And I just like using that as an example to think, man, like, how weird is this,
Yeah, exactly. We can't even understand we can't understand our own consciousness yet. We don't have a theory of consciousness yet that it has any kind of totality to it.
And you know what? This is where, as a philosophy podcast, I get really excited, because I think that there's two reactions to this sort of thing, right? There's fear and uncertainty, a cognitive dissonance, or there's an excitement, right? Mm-hmm. Because and it depends on your sort of paradigm. If you like to think that we live at the height of, human accomplishments, and that, things aren't going to change, it's scary. But if you place us in the context of history and human development, and you see, man, there's so many things that we don't know, and so many other things that there are to explore. It gets real exciting, It's like,
it does.
Maybe I can be the one to come up with a theory of consciousness. Maybe if I look into it some and I gain enough knowledge, I'll have some way of figuring this out. Mm-hmm. But with the understanding that as soon as you figure that out, there's going to be 3 other questions that pop out of it, right?
There will be, and that's because it's coming from the consciousness of other beings, each of which is unique to that being. So there is never going to be an end to questions. Yeah. Yeah, so this has been great. I think this is going to lead us into a lot of other interesting topics. So, I want to thank everybody. We're separate again. We're not in the studio. You can probably tell by the audio quality. COVID cases in our region have really spiked. So we're going over distance. Hopefully we can get you a good enough quality that you don't mind sitting through the podcast. And bear with us a little bit, and once things settle down, we'll be back in the studio and good to go. But in the meantime, we look forward to continuing to have some of these great conversations over distance. So thanks for being with me, Norm. And until next time, keep pondering, everybody.